Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on Thursday, the 10th of February. I'm Kate Andrews, the Spectator's economics editor, and your host this week. On this week's show, after a bruising few weeks in Westminster and desperate to avoid a vote of no confidence, Boris Johnson has been left beholden to the demands of Tory MPs. Can the PM get out of his bunker? I'll speak to the Spectator's James Forsyth and Katy. Figures leaked to the Spectator this week show the NHS waiting list could peak at 9 million in England, and that's the optimistic scenario. But with taxpayers already stumping up another £12 billion for the health service through a national insurance rise, are we really getting value for money? Culture Secretary Nadine Dorries has vowed to take action against companies like Netflix following a social media outrage over a Holocaust joke in Jimmy Carr's new show, broadcast on the streaming giant. Douglas Murray says the government is overstepping the mark. He'll be on the show. Kirsty Allsopp was ridiculed for saying that if young people want to buy a house, they should give up luxuries like gym memberships and holidays abroad and just move somewhere cheaper. Does she have a point? And finally, what does the collapse of the Soviet Union tell us about Russia today? Two experts will join me to discuss. Before we get going, a very special thank you to Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management, who are sponsoring the Week in 60 Minutes. Canaccord are experienced wealth planners and investment managers who go above and beyond to offer you support and guidance. Just visit candowealth.com to find out more. And remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel too. Click the red button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. And now on to the show. Boris Johnson's premiership is teetering, desperate to avoid hitting the 54-letter threshold that would trigger a confidence vote in his leadership. He is hunkering down, appealing to Tory MPs to keep him in the job and making promises to keep those MPs happy. In this week's cover piece, James Forsyth looks at Boris's bunker, the Prime Minister's new defensive strategy to keep himself in number 10. James joins me now alongside Katy. James, in your cover piece this week, you take us into the depths of Boris's bunker. Dare I ask what we find there?
So I think that Boris Johnson's aim right now is to placate his MPs. As the old Yes Prime Minister joke has it, the public can't vote against you until the next election. Your MPs can vote against you this evening. Or in Boris Johnson's case, write a letter against him. That is what they are most worried about, because if the 54 letters go in, triggering a no confidence ballot, that is a disaster for Boris Johnson, because even if you win these votes, as Theresa May will tell you, they end up wounding you. It's a Pyrrhic victory, and that you are essentially at that point, more than 100 of your colleagues have said they have no confidence in you, and your premiership begins to bleed out from that moment forth. So they are doing everything they can to try and stop those 54 letters going in. So things that Tory MPs want happen. So you've had this shake-up of the number 10 staffing operation this week. You've had a new chief whip and a new deputy chief whip brought in this week. Things that are going to upset Tory MPs, like some aspects of Boris Johnson's anti-obesity strategy, are being dropped, despite him when he first came up with these ideas, talking about how personally important they were to him because of how convinced he was that his weight had contributed to how hard he was hit by COVID. So right now, we are in a world where Boris Johnson is doing everything he can to try and keep his own MPs on board. I think one of the problems is, something that Katy discusses very elegantly in her column, is that not all of his MPs want the same thing. So, take Article 16. There are people in the ERG parts of the party who want him to trigger that very soon. They argue that if you don't do it soon, that it would be a disaster to trigger Article 16 because it would trigger a trade war with Europe at precisely the wrong moment in both economic terms and geostrategic terms. So I think the difficulty is Boris Johnson is trying to please his MPs, but they don't all want the same thing.
And Katy, onto that column, it feels like a weekly, if not daily, battle for the Prime Minister to keep these letters at bay. You write in this week's magazine about the caucus in the Tory party that could make or break his premiership.
So I think there's various caucuses that will affect Boris Johnson in different ways, and there are almost an endless number now of Tory groups. So I begin in my column by talking about the One Nation group of Tories. That's around 40 strong group, but can go up, depending on how you judge how regularly someone attends or joins in with these calls. But then there's also, the Common Sense group, there's a European Research group, there's a COVID recovery group, and we can go on all day. But what I say in the column is ultimately the group that I think is viewed in numbers head as one that could take the number of letters over the threshold of 54 is the One Nation group. This is a group that ultimately have had little love for Boris Johnson, often see Boris Johnson at loggerheads of what they want to do. I think lots of people will say they're the One Nation Tory. It doesn't sound like something you don't want to be. But ultimately, this group, you were trying to define them, tend to occupy traditional Tory seats. Some of them are Lib Dem Tory marginals. This group were particularly incensed when with the foreign aid cut. They've also, during the EU referendum, veered towards Remain. And Boris Johnson, I chaired the hustings for the One Nation group where Boris Johnson appeared before them, and it was definitely viewed as one of his toughest audience because this group are harder for him to win round. So when it comes to letters, and I think at the weekend when you had former Minister Nick Gibbs' letter go in, lots of cabinet ministers were venting, saying this is the One Nation Tories. But I think what's interesting, which points to James's argument about how it's so hard to keep everyone happy, I think the One Nation group could, if they wanted to, trigger a confidence vote in the next, few days, weeks. But what is keeping some of them from doing that, some of them who are being very critical of the Prime Minister but have not yet submitted a letter, is they're not convinced that Boris Johnson would lose that vote right now. They think more people from other parts of the party need to turn before you get to that point.
And Katy, what about some of those other groups that could still cause Boris Johnson a headache? You mentioned in your column the God Squad, for example.
Yeah, so I think the groups that are currently seen as, I wouldn't say beyond the pale, but the ones that are, hardest to bring back in, the biggest problem in terms of letters, are One Nation group and also those religious Tories, which someone, Boris allies refer to as the God Squad. And you've seen, Gary Streeter, one member of this group, a Christian, he put in a letter last week. And I think that the issue here, or what is worrying those trying to prop the Prime Minister up, as one put it to me, is their concern this group might just take the view that the Prime Minister is not very moral. And where do you go from there? I think that you can see this week in terms of the moves Boris Johnson is doing, as James documents, cover piece, but also in those PPS appointments, which is the lowest rung of the ladder in government, that the Prime Minister now has new PPSs, and they're really coming from the right of the party. James Duddridge, you have Joy Morrissey, and I think in doing this, he's clearly decided that his future is going to be won through shoring up support on the right.
And James, on that point, we've seen changes in Downing Street now. There was a big clear out of some of his top advisors. We've had a mini reshuffle. Is this enough to convince MPs that are frustrated that the right changes have been made?
So I think there is a kind of broad inclination to give Boris Johnson and this new setup a bit of time, because it also suits Tory MPs to give them a bit of time, because lots of them still want to wait for this police investigation to finish and the Sue Gray report to be published. I think that you also see that Boris Johnson is trying to say to Tory MPs, look, I get the big calls right. I might not have handled, how Downing Street operated during lockdown right, but, look at the fact we're ending all the COVID restrictions in England. An announcement he's brought forward by a month. He told Tory MPs that before Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday. But I think one of the things that worries Tory MPs is what will make this story go away. We have had in the last week or so 3 really big government announcements, but all of them have been stepped on by this story or muddied by this story. So you had the Levelling Up white paper, and you remember that Levelling Up is meant to be the defining mission of this government. That was overshadowed by the fact that 3 letters went in that day. Then you had the government spending over £9 billion to help people with their energy bills. A big intervention in the cost of living debate. And yet that was overshadowed by the resignation of Munira Mirza over Boris Johnson's Jimmy Savile Bob at Keir Starmer. Then you had, on Wednesday, you had the Prime Minister announcing that all COVID restrictions would end and a month early. that was overshadowed by the news that the police were writing to 50 people about the alleged lockdown breaches in Downing Street. And I think what Tory MPs want is for this story to go away. And I think that the kind of question is, how do you make it go away? And I think this is what is worrying them. I think there is an inclination to give this new Downing Street setup a bit of time, but I think that the biggest desire is, how do we make this story go away?
And Katy, Boris isn't in that bunker alone. His wife, Carrie Johnson, has been getting more attention these past few weeks in the media about the role that she's been playing behind the scenes.
Yeah, so there's a book coming out by Lord Ashcroft that was serialised over the weekend in the Mail on Sunday, and there's been a big kickback from Number 10 against that book, against the claims in that book about which suggests that Carrie Johnson has a huge influence over the Prime Minister and ultimately blames her for various things that have gone wrong. And you've seen cabinet ministers such as Sajid Javid say, it's sexist. Kwasi Kwarteng on Sunday wouldn't say it was sexist, but did say that it was interesting that people going after, a younger Prime Minister's partner than previous ones. I think that obviously the full book is not out yet. I think that we have seen in recent weeks questions over the various flat parties. The fact that we now expect 50 members of Downing Street to be interviewed over Partygate after the Sugo's investigation was referred to the police, and the expectation is that will include Boris Johnson and his wife Carrie. So I think it's undeniable that she is part of the story. Also, if you look at the refurbishment of the flat, still lots of questions about this. But ultimately, I think what's going to decide Boris Johnson's future isn't so much his partner as, and I think this goes also to bringing new people in. Boris Johnson has lots of people around him, but I think increasingly as we get, resets and, blame games, it's more MPs working out if actually Boris Johnson is the problem because he is the one ultimately making the final decisions on things.
James, even if Boris Johnson's defensive strategy works for a while, this doesn't feel like a very sustainable way of governing the nation.
Yeah, look, a government has to have higher ambitions than just keeping its own MPs happy. I think one of the things that is contributing to the discontent with Boris Johnson right now is a feeling that the Tories have won their biggest majority since Margaret Thatcher, but they're not doing very much with it. I think that is one of the big problems that the government has, that people question what is going on. And you look at your superb story this week, Kate, about the NHS backlog. People are saying, well, hang on a second, what are we doing? We've increased taxes we're planning to increase taxes in April with the aim of clearing that backlog. Yet all of a sudden we've been told that this backlog is going to be going up until March 2024. And one Tory minister told me on having heard that, he said, look, if the NHS waiting list isn't going to start to go down even on the government's targets by March 2024, that is the most worrying news for the Tory party, regardless of who the leader is, because that exposes them to both the attack that, you can't trust the Tories with the NHS, and also where did the money from that tax rise go? What good did it do? And so I think this sense of drift is a problem for the government because it is compounding kind of people's worries about whether this 80-seat majority is being squandered.
Katy, how long can the Prime Minister prioritise his MPs over his voters?
Well, the question is, do they align? And I think the view of many MPs is the problem is Boris Johnson has been prioritising his advisors, his aides in Number 10, over what they have been saying, and they think they reflect their constituents more. So if you think about national insurance, lots of Tory MPs, the bulk, could not stand that as a policy, clearly pressing on. But I think that, Boris Johnson is also facing lots of resistance over things such as his plan for cycling, parts of the green agenda. So ultimately, I don't think it's as simple as who is he listening to, voters or MPs. I think there's ultimately a question going forward as to what is the direction of Boris Johnson's government. Just as with the electorate, the MPs want different things from him, and I think he is going to have to start picking a course.
James and Katy, thanks for joining me. Figures leaked to The Spectator this week show that despite a £12 billion cash injection, more than 9 million people could be on an NHS waiting list by 2024. What's gone so wrong? I'm joined now by Chris Hopson, the CEO of NHS Providers. Chris, thank you so much for joining Spectator TV. Now, this Tuesday in the House of Commons, the Health Secretary Sajid Javid laid out his elective recovery plan, and this is supposedly the parameters for how and in what time frame we're going to tackle the NHS backlog that's been made significantly worse by COVID-19 and the subsequent lockdowns. The waitlist was at a record high 4.4 million pre-pandemic. It's now around 6 million and is estimated to skyrocket further. What do you make of all this?
Well, it's a very important moment for the NHS. I mean, everybody in the NHS knows that it's to start in the right place for me, which is with the patients, which is we know because of COVID, but also, yes, you're right, the waiting lists were increasing before we went into COVID. We do have far too many patients who are having to wait too long for treatment, and we absolutely know that that potentially has a really serious impact. There are people who are living in pain. There are people who, if we can't treat them quick enough, do risk having their conditions worsen and become permanently worse. So there's a real understanding in the NHS that we need to get through these backlogs absolutely as quickly as possible. We also have been waiting for this plan. We did a lot of work on it before Christmas. It's now been finalised and is ready to go. And that it indicates to us how the money is going to be spent, but it also sets out very, very clearly some more detailed targets that we had when the money was first announced about exactly what people can expect for this extra investment that the money is putting, that the government is putting in.
Some figures were held back, though. So Javid said in the House of Commons that by March 2024, that waitlist would peak and start to fall. But he stressed that in the meantime, the waitlist was going to rise. And by how much has been that question that nobody seems to want to answer. The Spectator in the magazine this week does start to try to answer that question, revealing classified NHS modelling used to come up with that date. And it shows a peak of 9.2 million on the NHS waiting list by March 2024, and that's in the optimistic scenario. That's expected or forecast to fall to 8.5 million by March 2025. So that would be a new national insurance levy, billions more for the NHS to take us to a wait list in 3 years' time. That's actually 2 million higher than where we are now. Is that really good value for money?
Well, I think if you don't mind, I'll challenge the word nobody wants to answer what the waiting list might look like. The reason we can't answer what the size of the waiting list looks like is because it depends upon the number of people who didn't come forward for treatment during COVID, how many of those actually come forward. And I've been tweeting over the last couple of days to say one of the problems the NHS faces is that we can be hopefully relatively clear about the volume of activity we can get through, which is why when the money was first announced, we made a very stretching commitment that we would have around 130% of activity compared to pre-COVID levels would be delivered by 24-25. But the bit that's really difficult for us is being clear about how quickly we can get through the waiting list, because we simply don't know how many extra patients are going to come forward. And what we don't want to do is we don't want to make commitments that we can't deliver, because then everybody will jump on us and say, hey, look, you promised you would deliver this by a certain date and you haven't. And we also, to be frank, we don't want to let patients down. We want to be very clear about what the expectation for patients should be, and that when we make those commitments, we know we must deliver them, because otherwise patients are going to be led down the garden path in a way that's inappropriate. So it's not because the NHS is foot dragging. It's not because that we kind of don't want to make commitments. It's not because we don't want to answer questions. It's not because there's private secret modelling that we're not revealing. It's basically because this is a very uncertain situation, and we feel it's right to play it fair for our patients, play it fair for our staff by only making commitments that we know are deliverable. They're stretching ambitions that we've now announced yesterday, earlier on this week, but we know they're deliverable.
So as you say, nobody has a crystal ball, of course, and forecasts aren't perfect predictions. When the information changes, you often have to change the forecasts, and we don't know how many people are going to be coming forward. And you also say you don't want to get expectations higher for patients who, of course, have been waiting a long time, and that's very understandable. But the truth is there are forecasts being done. There are NHS models that the NHS has access to, the Department of Health has access to, that were deliberately not announced by the NHS or by politicians. Because that data, the 9.2 million peak, the 8.5 million by 2025, it isn't pretty. I can totally appreciate not wanting to heighten expectations, but don't you think that we should level with the public, be honest with the public, especially as their tax money is going up? They're going to expect to get better results. And the very difficult truth is that things are going to look worse in 3 years' time than they look right now. I mean, don't you think the public at least deserve to know that?
Well, Kate, you can't say that things will definitely look worse in 3 years' time because we absolutely don't know the answer to that question. What we can absolutely say, and of course you're right, this is a taxpayer-funded system. It is quite rightly led by politicians who have to account in the House of Commons for how that money is spent. And of course, all of our trust leaders are absolutely focused on delivering value for money because they know that this is taxpayers' money and that they should be held accountable for how much they deliver for that money. And that's precisely why we have made these much more detailed commitments than were made in the initial announcement, where, as I said, we committed to a level of elective activity around 130% by 24-25, while we've done more work to try and give patients a clearer indication with a degree of specificity, for example, breaking out cancer, about when they can expect to be treated, because that's part of being held accountable. I just, the bit that, if I'm honest, Kate, I found difficult about the article that you wrote is the sort of implication that sits behind it, that somehow NHS trust leaders are kind of seeking to evade accountability. They're seeking to hide information. They're seeking to effectively, as I said, be dragged into setting an ambitious target. Nothing could be further from the truth. Every single trust chief executive that I talk to is really clear about the moral imperative here about treating these backlogs as quickly as they possibly can, because day in, day out, they are talking to patients and they are seeing patients who are in pain. So they are going absolutely as fast as they can, and they're absolutely stretching as far as they can to meet these targets. But they also, quite rightly, are saying they have to be deliverable. So I don't quite see this picture of somehow a reluctant NHS being dragged into making commitments, when actually it's those trust leaders who want to make as stretching commitments as possible, because they know the impact on patients if they don't make those commitments.
Well, I don't at all pretend to know what's in the hearts of the NHS officials who are negotiating this. Just looking at the details of what was once thought to be agreed, at least on the political side, was that if you go back to summer 2021, there was modeling coming out from the Department of Health showing that hopefully by 2025 you would have a wait list that was closer to 5.5 million based on the tax rise, the substantial manifesto-breaking tax rise that politicians were considering. And somehow you get just a few months down the road, and that's gone up by millions, and the situation 3 years' time is forecast to look a lot worse than it does now. And I know that that information wasn't wanted in the public domain. So again, it's very reasonable to say that, you think the NHS is doing its best. It's reasonable to say that we don't want to make promises we're not sure we can keep. But this elective recovery plan has been based off these models, based off this time frame, which has not been published. And again, as you point out, for the patients who are in pain, who are suffering, many who are going to really struggle until they get access to some of the selective care that they need, shouldn't they have a reasonable idea of the time frame that the NHS is looking at behind closed doors? Shouldn't that be opened so that the patients themselves at least know what the NHS and this recovery plan is based off of, their assumptions at the moment, even if those assumptions change, because of course that can be updated?
Well, again, I'm afraid I don't quite recognise the narrative here in terms of, and I've spoken to the people who on the NHS side have been doing the detailed discussions, and where we were was that, exactly as you say, last September-ish, whenever the government made their announcement around the extra money for the NHS, we did a lot of careful work to agree a specific top-level activity target around 130% of pre-COVID elective activity. The work that we've then been doing since is exactly what you just said we're keen to avoid, which is actually to how do you turn that into some commitments for patients? Because we know that patients aren't interested about how much activity the NHS is getting through. What they want to know is when are they going to get their treatment? And that's precisely why earlier on this week we announced a set of detailed, and they are very stretching, they are challenging ambitions, but the crucial bit is we know that they're deliverable. And so I just don't recognise, and neither do the people who've been working on this from the NHS side, recognise a narrative that says that we've been trying to hide things. There have been kind of sort of secret pieces of analysis done that haven't been put in the public domain. What we've put in the public domain is rightly what we should have done, which is stretching, deliverable, ambitious, but clear targets about when people can expect to be treated.
Well, the forecasts are now in the public domain. You can read about them in the Spectator magazine this week, and I suppose the public can make up their minds as to whether or not they thought that should have been published along with the recovery plan. But let me ask you, are you confident now that the NHS officials and the government departments are broadly on the same page about the metrics that need to be achieved over the next few years when it comes to the backlog and many of the other aspects laid out in the recovery plan? Because I know from your thread on Twitter that it's about achieving those metrics and those targets that matters a lot to you.
Yes, I mean, so there was some interesting kind of speculation earlier on in the week as to why there was a delay in the plan. And I tweeted why I thought there had been a delay in the plan, which is, you know what happens when you draw up a plan is right when you get to the last moment, you agree all the final details. And what had happened has been that over the last 2 or 3 weeks, there's been a lot of hugely important work being done in precisely the areas we've been talking about, which is what level of metrics, how many of them, time commitments, but also levels of commitment against particular metrics. In other words, what percentage of, for example, cancer diagnosis would we get within the required target? That work was done at real pace, and it's been done really, very close to publication date. What then happens is, quite rightly, is there's then a debate around Whitehall, and there's an assurance exercise where effectively everybody kind of needs to sign off. And where we've got to is an agreed position between the Department of Health and Social Care, NHS England, Number 10 and the Treasury. And yes, of course you'd expect there to be backwards and forwardsing on that, because that's the nature of the relationship between the NHS and centre of government. And it's not the NHS controlling the rest of government, again, as your article implied. It's actually a process of negotiation and agreement between all of those different parties. And that's where we've got to. And the NHS is now very clear. We've been pushed hard, as we should have been, by government. We've pushed ourselves hard for the reasons I've explained. We do now have an agreed set of metrics that we will all now be working incredibly hard to deliver. And that's the process working as it should be. And if I'm honest, part of the problem here is that if you try and pick out individual elements of the process and say, hey, look at this potential scenario, here's a leaked document that basically says, some potential scenario planning, what you're not looking at is the whole. And I think it's perfectly reasonable for everybody who's taken part in those negotiations to basically say we've got to the most stretching and deliverable place that we could have got to given the context, and the NHS is now absolutely committed to delivering those targets, and we're absolutely if you look at all our frontline leaders, they are now ready to deliver what needs to be done, and that's how the process should work.
I think, again, looking in the round, looking at the fact that this isn't just about tackling the backlog, it's about the tax rise to pay for tackling that backlog, it's about all the decisions that have been made around COVID and delaying certain kinds of care. The forecast from which that whole plan is going to be jetted off from is one that potentially is going to be of interest to the public. And again, they can check it out in the magazine this week. My last question to you, Chris, then, is if you do think that, broadly speaking now, having sorted out the technicalities, that these government departments, Number 10 and the NHS, are roughly on the same page, do you think the tax hike, do you think the money that's going to go to tackling the backlog is going to be enough? Or are we going to see conversations in the near to medium future in which the NHS suggests it needs more funds? Or do you think this is now going to cover it?
Well, I think it's very inappropriate, and I've said this for 2 or 3 people over the last few days. It would be completely inappropriate for me, as somebody representing frontline NHS organisations, to come on and say, hey, the money we've been given is not enough, before it's even arrived and we've even started spending it. The point I have made, though, which feels to me to be an important one, is if you look at the long-term projections here, and I'll give you one example. The Health Foundation, a completely independent health think tank, is saying that we need 1 million more health and care staff by 2030-31 in order to provide the same level of care as we are currently receiving. What that basically means is we will need a discussion about exactly, over the longer term, mid to long term, about what level of funding the NHS needs to provide the right level of care in an environment where right the way across the world, and we're not unusual about this, the demand for care is rising. And this is one of the challenges that being in a taxpayer-funded system brings. There are lots of huge advantages. The equity is really important. The NHS is one of the most efficient systems, health systems in the world, and that regularly comes out of the data that's produced. But the question we will need to ask ourselves is, given the rising demand for care that every advanced Western economy is seeing, we will need to have the debate about, longer term, what funding does the NHS need and our wider social care system need in order to continue to provide the right quality of care. And to be frank, expectations of the quality of care are rising.
I do have to wonder if the forecast 8.5 million on the waitlist by 2025 will agree that the system is completely equitable, but we'll have to leave it there. Chris, thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much indeed.
From Sajid Javid to Zara Sultana, politicians from the right and left have attacked Jimmy Carr for a joke he made about the Holocaust in his latest comedy show. For context, here's what he said.
When people talk about the Holocaust, they talk about the tragedy and horror of 6 million Jewish lives being lost to the Nazi war machine. But they never mention the thousands of gypsies that were killed by the Nazis. No one ever wants to talk about that because no one ever wants to talk about the positives.
In his column for the magazine this week, Douglas Murray says that while Carr is, quote, one of the comedians I dislike the most, and despite the joke being, quote, cruel and unwitty, government regulation will set a dangerous precedent. To explain, Douglas joins me now. Douglas, in this week's magazine, you write about Jimmy Carr. What do you make from the fallout from his Netflix special?
Well, there's several very interesting things about it. One of them is that Jimmy Carr, I'm not a fan of his. I'm sort of standing up for his right to make jokes, including unpleasant jokes. But what I think is happening here is, first of all, is what is known as context collapse, where an in-group's conversation is discovered by an out-group. Jimmy Carr's audience know exactly what they're getting when they go to his shows. It's one reason I don't go to his shows. I don't particularly like what he offers. But his audience, his fans, know what they're getting when they go to his shows or when they click on his Netflix specials. What's happened this past week has been that an out-group has discovered a part of this material. One joke from his show, His Dark Material, was excerpted, sent around on Twitter, and he was then subjected to the inevitable 5 minutes of hate, which follows. It's a very typical story. And I think that the most worrying bit of it is actually not the public or Twitter sphere reaction, which is as deranging and deranged as it always is. The most disturbing thing is that government ministers once again have felt that they need to intervene and say what they think should be joked about and what should not.
Yeah, so the Culture Secretary Nadine Dorris has said that the joke was shocking and has suggested that the government would be looking at ways to sanction outlets like Netflix if they were to publish this sort of thing. I can't help but feel this is going to go badly, badly wrong.
Yeah, as ever with politicians, you get this horrible feeling like we've not discussed free speech before. Whereas in Britain, we've discussed it for centuries. And we know the parameters, and we know the problems, and we know the risks, and we know the rewards. But yes, the idea that Nadine Dorries feels compelled to speak about this, and of course she's as culture secretary, she's actually potentially got some sway on it. Sajid Javid, once again, strangely, it's another intervention from him in the free speech issue, has also condemned this. Well, what does the health secretary have to do with deciding what content Netflix should or shouldn't put out? What jokes people should or shouldn't say? And then you've got the worst person of all, is totally unheard of previously, SNP councillor. Of course, it's someone from the SNP who have less understanding of freedom than perhaps anybody else in the country. But it's an SNP councillor who has called not just for the prosecution of Jimmy Carr for hate speech, but the prosecution of his audience for laughing. I mean, this is just, as I say, maybe we can just ignore it because it's an SNP councillor. But it's very worrying that anyone in any position of power at all in this country has such a lack of understanding of basic freedoms that they think you should be able to prosecute people for being caught laughing at the wrong material. It's pathetic.
Well, Douglas, to go back to Jimmy Carr, you write in your column that if you find a joke distasteful, if you find a comedian distasteful, there's a really easy way of handling this, and that's just don't tune in, don't watch them. Do you think there's ever a time where a joke can go too far in which just saying, I'm tuning out, I'm not paying attention, isn't quite good enough?
Oh, I think jokes go too far all the time. One of the points of comedy in a society is to try to work out where those points are. Another point, by the way, of comedy is to help us deal with very unpleasant and ugly things about life. You know, the old saying, if you didn't laugh, you'd cry, comes from a very basic recognition about comedy, which is that it helps us through horrible, ugly, dark things. Now, I think some comedians are very, very adept at finding their way through that. Jimmy Carr, to give him credit, I say I'm not an admirer of his particularly, to give him credit, isn't bad at navigating some of that. There are much better people, Ricky Gervais, for instance. But I mean, the history of comedy is of people trying to find their way through the maze of current taboos and much more. And so, of course, people can go too far. But the other point about that is they can go too far for certain audiences. As I say, again, it's about this in-group, out-group thing. A particular audience knows what they're going to get. And an outside audience may not be aware of that at all. And this is happening not just with comedy, it's happening with literature and much more. But I think that it's strange that in our era, comedians keep on becoming the sort of brunt of these strange stampedes that happened recently with a far more talented comedian than Jimmy Carr, which is Dave Chappelle in the States. And the reason why it's happening, as I say, is because comedians are meant to explore difficult material.
Douglas, one really interesting part of your column was where you talk about Ricky Gervais and a joke that he has made about Anne Frank. And you say in the column that you think he was just on the right side of the line. You think he just got away with it. But you also say that you probably have to be Jewish or making a deeper point in order to make a joke like that. And I'm curious, do you think that that is the case when it comes to humor for all forms of identity?
Yes, I think so. I think that it's a comedian has to earn the trust of his audience for them to allow him or her to go to transgressive places. Now, the obvious thing is that an audience is more likely to trust a particular comedian, that they're going to go to those places and be trustworthy, as it were, if that person already is clearly not, for instance, beating up on a particular minority for the sake of them being a minority. The most obvious example is there are things that black comedians are able to say which white comedians are not. There are things that Jewish comedians are able to say that non-Jewish comedians are not. And I give this example in the piece about, as it were, jokes about the Holocaust, because there are some Jewish jokes about the Holocaust. And it's a sort of subgenre, and it's a very, very complex terrain. But one of the things that has existed in what jokes there are about the Holocaust is an attempt not just to deal with the horror, but to say something about it. I give an example in the piece of a joke of two men killed in the Holocaust. They're in heaven. They're talking. And they're laughing about something that happened in the camps. And they're laughing so much they attract the attention of God, who's passing by. And God stops and he says, my children, how can you laugh at such things? And one of them says to God, I guess you had to be there. Now, I mean, that's a joke with a heck of a punch. And it has a real point to it. Now, I think, again, if audiences have to feel a confidence that the comedian is doing something that and has their trust. The example I give of the Ricky Gervais joke about Anne Frank, which I thought, as I say, and the piece that you just quoted was just about on the borderline, was I said, I'm not quite sure you've earned the right to do that. In other words, I sort of think a long, a very elderly comedian, preferably Jewish, could potentially get away with that joke. But you have to sort of trust. You have to trust them. Now, I trust Ricky Gervais on that. But that trust element with the audience is incredibly important. But this is about the sort of finery of comedy and comedy techniques. And what I worry about is a much broader thing, which is comedians keep on getting it at the moment because they're at the forefront of some of the free speech issues of our time. And the absolutely central issue of our time on this is a deep misunderstanding, or at least uncertainty in our societies, about what is speech and what is action. And this sort of condemnation of Jimmy Carr for this, I think, very tasteless and unfunny joke seems to me to be constantly, not just by the idiot SNP councillor, but by others as well, confused with action. These are words. It is a joke, and you either laugh or you don't. It's not the same as action. And we've sort of told ourselves in our age that speech and action are so close to each other that you have to always stamp down on the speech, otherwise action will inevitably follow. And I don't think that is the case. I think it's very lazy. And as I say toward the end of the piece, I think one of the reasons why these sort of stamping on the comedians is happening is because it is quite easy in the court to hang the jester. It's much easier than ruling the land justly or wisely. And I think that our ministers and even our councillors should reflect on that.
And Douglas, Netflix so far have not taken down the Jimmy Carr special. In the age of cancel culture, it feels like not taking something down feels like a bit of a win for free speech. But I'm curious as to how this compares to Spotify and Joe Rogan. While I have you here, I'd love to know what you think of what's been happening to him. And I know that you've been on his show a few times.
Yeah, I admire Joe enormously. He's a seriously talented comedian and an unbelievably talented podcaster. I don't think people realize, unless they've seen it done badly, as it were, what it involves to be as good at what he does as Joe is. It's quite amazing to have sort of multi-hour conversations. It's completely gripping. He has trust of his audience, and again, it comes back to the same thing. It's an in-group, out-group thing. Joe Rogan has a larger following than any commercial television channel, and a lot of the old media have been gunning for Joe, and they've been doing it through very typical means. Again, selecting certain things that they believe are being said, that the people in the conversation know are not being said. So the BBC and others this week just ran a story claiming that Joe Rogan has had to apologize for racist language in the past. They imply that Joe Rogan has been a racist in the past and has been caught using racist language. And this isn't the case at all. And all of Joe Rogan's followers know that he's the furthest person from being a racist you could possibly be. It's an absurd and obscene accusation. But the allegation is made because on occasions in the past they found times when he has used the N-word in the context of quoting somebody using the N-word. And now there is a total prohibition on even quoting people saying that. And that is quite different from somebody throwing around racist language and calling people, vile racist terms. So the old media has tried to destroy this absolute top figure in the new media. I think it won't work. I think Spotify are absolutely right to stand beside him, should stand beside him, and not just for commercial reasons, but for very obvious strategic and moral ones. Because if you allow the mob to take out somebody as important, as impressive as Joe Rogan, it'll take out absolutely everybody next. So Spotify should absolutely stand behind him. I'm glad they have so far. I hope that Netflix stand up for Jimmy Carr. I hope that everybody stands up for their mates. I hope that everyone stands up for the right of people to make jokes and to explore difficult things. And obviously this is partly, as you know, Kate, an issue of self-interest as well, because after they've got rid of all of the comedians, they'll be coming for the writers and journalists. And you and I better watch our backs.
Well, Douglas, I very much hope that everybody reads your column this week in the Spectator magazine. Thanks for joining me.
It's a great pleasure.
At the weekend, Location host Kirsty Allsopp found herself in trouble after suggesting that if young people wanted to buy a house, they should just move somewhere cheaper. In a piece for Coffee House this week, Matthew Lynn says that Allsopp has got it all wrong. He joins me now. Matthew, thank you for joining Spectator TV. So first, can you update viewers on what it is that Kirsty Allsopp, the presenter of Location, has said about the housing crisis?
Yeah, she's saying something which I think actually people have said before, and it's probably been said by people of her generation around a dinner party. She was making the point. Obviously, there's a lot of discussion about how younger people, particularly people in their 20s, early 30s, are really been struggling to get on the property ladder. And she was making the argument that if they were just a little bit extravagant, if they cut back on their Netflix subscriptions and their holidays and their gym memberships and their Pelotons and all that kind of stuff, cut back a little bit on the avocado brunches, then they might be able to afford a house. She was arguing, when she was first getting on the property ladder, she walked to work and she saved every penny she could, and that kind of got her started. And in fairness, that stuff hits a nerve. I think particularly with people. I think Kirsty's around 50 or so. I don't want to exaggerate her age, but I think I did check it. It probably does hit a nerve, but I'm not actually convinced that she was right about that. But she certainly stirred things up and attracted a lot of attention.
Well, you've written on Coffee House that it isn't so easy these days as to simply cut out the brunch.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I actually think it was you sort of sympathise with it a little bit, and I'm in my 50s as well, so if you're that, the people in there, they are kind of a bit irritating, and that's even before we get into their taste in music, and they possibly are a little bit more extravagant than people were 20 or 30 years ago. But I think she's missing the bigger picture. Actually, the truth is, we do have problems in the housing market in the UK, quite severe problems. And there's really, there's actually two big issues which she's just completely overlooking. One, we have a very, very dysfunctional planning system, and people have talked about that as Spectator and lots of the mainstream media. We haven't built enough houses for 20 or 30 years. We had very, very high levels of immigration, certainly leading up to Brexit, but actually post-Brexit as well, we still have quite high levels. We have changing family composition. People think about that. Families split up more, divorce rates have been higher, so what used to be one unit turns into 2 or 3 units, and that again creates housing demand. We haven't been building nearly because we've restricted the amount of land that people can have and the amount of development that's allowed. We haven't been building enough houses to keep up with demand, and that was probably true in the 1980s. But as you just when you start artificially restricting supply, it just gets worse and worse with every decade that comes along. So that's one big thing that's happened. So that's made houses more expensive. And the other thing we've done is we've manipulated the financial markets. We've had a decade of QE. We're probably heading into another decade of it. And that's pushed up the prices of every form of asset. It's pushed up equity prices. It's pushed up bond prices. But most of all, it's pushed up housing prices. And we've had an acceleration of housing prices. So you stop and look at the numbers. When Kirsty Allsopp was buying her first property, the average house cost 5 times what she says was her then starting salary, $11,500, and now it costs 9 times the average starting salary. So there is just a big difference, and just cutting back on your Netflix subscription and going to the gym a bit less, and cutting back on the avocados, that's not going to find the extra $100,000 that you need to get on the property ladder. It's facetious.
And tragically, it seems like plans to tackle our archaic planning system in government have been shelved. One thing that really riled people up about Alsop's article wasn't just the dismissiveness of young people's lifestyles, but the fact that she says that she got family help when she bought her first home. And articles like this seem to surface every 6 months or so. Somebody says, here's how I bought my home by age 24, 28, 30, why you can do it too. And what always comes out in the article is certainly hard work, determination, saving wherever they can. But very, very often, almost every single time, they either admit that they were able to live rent-free in their parents' home or that they got a big payout from the bank of mom and dad to help them get on the housing ladder. That doesn't sit well with people who don't have those options.
No, I think that's true. I mean, if your father was a baronet, as in Kirsty Allsop's case, and you got help from your parents to get a start on the property ladder, I think the truth is you should pipe down a little bit, and it's not a good look. You should remember that, and people are still obviously getting a lot of help from their parents. Most of the 20-somethings who probably buy their first property in London or the Southeast or some of the big cities, like Manchester or Bristol or Leeds, probably are getting help from their grandparents or their parents. But as you absolutely rightly say, not everyone's in that position, and it should be possible. For really what we should be doing with the housing market is taking a step back and thinking it should be possible in a reasonably prosperous country that has actually plenty of land. Certainly don't really need it for farming because we could import food from around the world. Has plenty of land. It should be possible for somebody with a decent job on the average wage to buy a reasonably nice home. That should be achievable. And actually, you mentioned the planning system. Unfortunately, we talked about it a bit. And as so much of the stuff with its current government, they kind of talk about it a little bit, and they're in the same universe as the right ideas. They acknowledge the right ideas, but when it comes to actually doing them, they seem to back away and get nervous. So they've backed away from planning reform, which they talked a little bit, but they should press on with it and look at how we actually get the housing market in the right place. Because as I said a moment ago, people shouldn't need help from their parents. Somebody who's earning the average wage in most of the country should be able to, be able to afford a decent home. And actually, another thing she said in her article, which kind of riled people up and again was wrong, was that they should look at other areas. If you can't afford a house in London or the nicer bits of the home counties or at the centre of Manchester, go to somewhere cheaper like County Durham or bits of the southwest. And again, it's kind of a glib thing to say. It gets some attention on social media, but she's wrong. We shouldn't be doing that as a country, because what we really want where we want the workers to go to where they're the most productive. I mean, you know the economics of this stuff. We don't particularly want people where the growing companies are. We want people to go to London. We want people to go to Bristol. We want people to go to Manchester. That's where the startups are. That's where the tech companies are. That's where we want the bright 25-year-olds to be. Joining those kind of companies. That's where their productivity is going to be highest, where they're going to contribute the most to the future growth of the company. But if they can't afford anywhere to live, that's making it very difficult. And we really shouldn't be saying, oh, let's just send them off to Truro or something, or let's send them to Rex.
If the government had its way, it would be sending businesses and the startups out to various regions as part of their leveling up agenda.
Where do we start, Kate? In
that very, very long paper. In that very, very long paper, I didn't see much in the way of incentivizing those businesses to actually head out to the regions, which is what they're going to need to get them to do if they're going to be successful. But let me ask as well, you write in your blog that there's an image of young people as being indulgent and ungrateful. Is there a bit of a prejudice here, do you think? And is that maybe one of the reasons that policymakers don't take the housing crisis as seriously as they should? Because as you said, if you're earning the average salary, you should be able to get on the housing ladder. I mean, I think people would just like to be able to imagine a time where they think they could get on the housing ladder. Maybe it won't be tomorrow or in 2 years' time, but they'd like to think that in 5 or 10 years' time they could buy a home. There's so many people in the country earning decent wages who still don't think that they can.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right, and I think it's I think it's a big problem, and I mean you may be on something. There may be a little there may be a little bit of a prejudice in that because they sort of look at the Netflix subscriptions and the gym memberships and the kind of levels of eating out, which possibly have may gone out. So maybe people of an older generation think that people in their 20s are a bit extravagant, but I just think it's silly. That's always going to be the case. I'm sure I'm sure my grandmother thought I was extravagant, because I went on a holiday once a year. People didn't used to do that. Everybody always thinks that. That's just a natural thing. And I come back to this point. I think you're absolutely right. I think it's a big problem that so many people have been cut out of the property market. It's actually very important, for a functioning economy and for a functioning democracy that people have a stake in the system and that they feel that they can aspire to something which should be pretty normal, and should be achievable within a prosperous country. And if they feel shut out from that, I think it is a big problem, and we should be doing more about it.
Matthew, thanks for joining Spectator TV.
Pleasure.
The possibility of war between Russia and Ukraine isn't going away, but after well over a month of tensions, we don't seem to be any clearer on whether Putin is really about to invade. Could the collapse of the Soviet Union teach us anything about Russia's intentions? In this week's magazine, we have a review of The Long Song of Tchaikovsky Street, written by Peter Waterdrinker, which is a first-hand account of the Soviet Union's final years. Professor Mark Galeotti is an expert in modern Russian history, and he joins me now alongside LSE's Professor Vladislav Zubok, author of Collapse, The Fall of the Soviet Union. Mark, Vladislav, thank you for joining me this week. Mark, we have a review in the magazine of Peter Waterdrinker's book, The Long Song of Tchaikovsky Street, which follows the end of the Soviet Union. What did you make of it?
Well, I really enjoyed it. I think I enjoyed it for several reasons. One is just simply it actually spoke to my own experiences. This was just the same sort of time that I was just beginning my academic career. I did my PhD with a lot of on-country research in the last 3 years of the declining, decaying, collapsing Soviet Union. So, a lot of it, in a admittedly much less exciting way than Peter Waterdrinker's experiences, but a lot of it, spoke to the stuff that I remembered. But secondly, I very much liked the way that it connected the collapse of the Soviet Union with the collapse of Tsarist Russia and the revolutions of 1917 in sometimes a fairly savage way. I wouldn't necessarily agree with the history of all of it, but the passionate way it interconnected this notions of collapses, revolutions, and countries devouring themselves, and yet still potentially bringing forth hope. That, I thought, was very nicely encapsulated by the book.
So Waterdrinker was in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Can you tell us a little bit about what that experience might have been like?
Oh boy, well, the very, very first time I ever went to the Soviet Union was actually in 1980, time of the Moscow Olympics, when Moscow was trying to sort of spruce itself up. But even then, one could really feel that this was a country that was sort of grinding to a collapse, but doing so in all the kind of, frankly, without making it sound too orientalizing, delightfully quirky ways that Russia often can. I remember being sort of accosted by a black marketeer in a hotel lift, and I was thinking, aye, I've heard all about this, they'll be wanting to buy my jeans or whatever. And in fact, he sidled up to me and said, "You have Agatha Christie?" There was even actually a black market for Agatha Christie novels. If only I'd known before I went. But then through the 1980s, you really could feel that this was a country that was grinding to a painful halt. Particularly, ironically enough, once Gorbachev was in power, with his quixotic attempt to try and actually bring some kind of reform to the country, which may well, indeed was, sort of driven by a desire to save the system, and yet it was exactly what was needed to bring the whole thing down. And certainly by the mid-late 80s, that inability to be able to find anything you really needed in the shops unless what you were really after was the collected works of Karl Marx. That sense that everybody, unless they were actually pretty high up within the system, was having to play the black market just for basic essentials. These are all the kind of ways in which, again, people wonder how come the Russians became such effective and rapacious capitalists. Well, the answer is they always were. But they were having to do it, off the books and so forth. But you really got to feel that in the 80s. And I think that, again, is something that comes out in this very kind of Wild East sense.
Vladislav, in your book Collapse, you write about the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, what changed between the late 80s, when Water Drinker would have been covering this, and 91, when the bloc fell?
Well, everything changed, and I lived there. I had my family. I had to raise my little son, and stood in line to buy milk for him, and had all kinds of course, recipes how to put food on the table. But I didn't belong to those Russians, as Mark said, who were ready for rapacious capitalism at all. And I think 90% of people around me were not, and they were totally unprepared for this rapaciousness that suddenly disgorged itself, like in the famous painting of Vesuvius engulfing Pompeii. And I think we were all covered by ash of this capitalism. At least it was a feeling of many people around them. I felt that they were struggling when the system disappeared, when the old economy came to a grinding halt. We're not covering the reasons for it. There were reasons, of course, but most importantly, the state disappeared, I think. Police didn't do their job. They just covered crime. The KGB, that was the last resort of the regime to deal with criminal economic gangs, mafias, also began to cover criminal cartels. So people felt completely defenseless. And that sense of being covered by the ash of Vesuvius, capitalist Vesuvius, being robbed cynically by one's so-called democratic government, and being exposed to any thief, any crook, anybody. That was the feeling that I carried with myself. Although at that time I was really privileged. I already had Western fellowships and stipends. I sort of shuttled back and forth, and I was okay, but I felt that the country around me was deeply humiliated.
People often say that the fall of the Soviet Union was inevitable, but you disagree. When do you think the bloc became untenable?
Well, I disagree on the basis of facts, because, when you put all the factors together that are listed in serious literature, beginning with, dysfunctional economy, overburdened by military expenditures, the falling oil prices, Chernobyl catastrophe, whatnot. You put it all together and still do not see how this economy could have collapsed so rapidly and so quickly. And then I realized, because when some economists pointed me to some intricacies of Soviet finances, Soviet economy, and as I listened, Gorbachev acted in a really strange way. He was like a captain of Titanic who directed his ship against the iceberg so that the iceberg would make more breaches into this Titanic again and again and again. And finally, the Titanic surely sank. But what surprised me, even to the end of the book, the Titanic of the Soviet Union had enormous resilience. And many people didn't expect it to sink, to capsize in such a quick way.
Mark, how present is the fall of the Soviet Union in the minds of Russian leaders, and in Putin's mind in particular?
I think this is it. I'm glad you distinguish between Russian leaders and Russian people, because for Russian people it has become much more historical. But I definitely feel that for Putin and that relatively small number of people surrounding him, it is still very current. And look, like all memories, it becomes mythologized over time. It's clear we had recently the 30th anniversary of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And if one looks at how people like Putin have, so to say, metabolized that, a lot of it is based on this notion that, Gorbachev was weak. And it was that weakness that allowed the system to collapse. It was that weakness that allowed the West to essentially define us and so forth. And that may well play into his beliefs about how he must demonstrate strength now. And, if one thinks of the experience of these people, these were all members of the system. They were all a Communist Party, in many cases KGB insiders. It's not just that they'd had their childhood and educational experiences in the Soviet system, but they'd had their sort of early career ones. They thought they were made. They thought they knew the way their futures were going to go, and it was pretty glorious. And then this whole system collapsed. And, you had the recent Putin saying that in the very early 90s, before he'd got his job, he was thinking about basically just driving a taxi. Well, this is a lieutenant colonel in the KGB, now thinking about having to drive a taxi to make ends meet. I think for them, it really has become a very sort of salient moment. And I think the two lessons that they've learned from that, or they feel they've learned from that, one is absolutely you need to be strong. Gorbachev was weak, and that's why it all fell apart. But the second thing is I think they've gone through this very rapid end of empire syndrome that so many countries go through. Britain has had to, France has had to, America will soon enough, where you almost move from the what have we lost to and who took it from us. So I think, again, the memories of the end of the Soviet Union have become tinged with a certain degree of vicious paranoia. But I think, again, that's because they still live in that world in a way that most Russians do not.
Vladislav, finally, what can the West learn from the collapse of the Soviet Union when it comes to dealing with Russia today? Do you think the West is making mistakes?
Well, the West always makes mistakes about Russia. That's, of course, given, because the West does not, just cannot find the proper medium to deal with Russia. It's either overly sympathetic to the point of sentimentality. There's a strand of memoirs and literature about heroic Russian people that suffer under that ungodly, bloody regime, be it Stalin or Putin. And there's another brand of literature of like Alphonse de Custine. It's Asia, a European veneer on Asian, essentially Oriental sense of people. From Kipling to Custine to I don't know, maybe Water Drinker. I haven't read the book, but I felt from the reviews there's some kind of strand of that. I think the truth is that people of Russia, like any people from the time of Thucydides, they can rally around the leader, they can turn against the leader. It really depends on many circumstances. But I think Russians, when there's a challenge, they tend to rally around the leader. However, they may dislike the leader. That happened under Stalin. And that may be happening under Putin, despite the fact that, Putin, of course, to a great extent instigated the current crisis. The Russians believe that there's a whole Europe coming against them currently. This is the matter, of course, of propaganda creating this image, but at the same time, it resonates deeply with the Russian national experience in the past. Napoleon, Hitler, it's all well known. So the West has to be really, really careful. All these, cries about sanctions and how much poor Russians would suffer as a result of the sanctions, I don't think they have any effect on the Russians, except for telling them, okay, we heard this before. Let's tighten up the belt and prepare for this road. It doesn't turn them against Putin. At least I don't sense it. Even my relatives, with whom I argue constantly about politics because they're not so pro-liberal and exposed to the West as I am, they say, let them come. We'll meet them. So there's some kind of irrational nationalism around this. So the West has to be careful not to wake the beast.
Mark and Vladislav, thank you for joining me. And that's it for this week. Once again, we're delighted that Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management is sponsoring the week in 60 minutes. Canaccord will provide the expertise you need to build your wealth with confidence. You can visit candowealth.com to find out more. And if you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to the Spectator's YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching, and do join us again next week.